Hi everyone, my name is Imogen and I'm from UNE Discovery. Coming to you from my house in lockdown. COVID is not going to stop the Soil Your Undies challenge, so today I'm presenting educational checkpoint number 2, the pH test. So by now your soil, your undies should be buried in your soil and decomposing, hopefully, and the amount of decomposition or breaking down of those undies tells us the level of your microbial activity, and that's an indicator of soil health. So this checkpoint helps us explore a little bit more about our soil health by measuring the pH of our soil. So what is pH? Well, it's basically just telling us how acidic something is. So when something has lots of acid in it, it has lots of hydrogen atoms. And that's why we call it pH, the power of hydrogen. The opposite of being acidic is what we call something that's alkaline, so that has much less acid in it. Now, everyday items, even around the house, have got a pH. Things that are acidic that we might come across regularly are things like vinegar or lemon juice. They're quite acidic. They've got that really sour kind of taste, but we can still ingest them and eat them as foods in small quantities. Things that are very, very acidic is something like battery acid. Also, we have acid in our stomachs, our stomach acid, and that helps us break down our foods. Things that are alkaline that we might come across every day are things like baking soda. Also, things that are very alkaline are things like oven cleaner and drain cleaner. So we measure pH on a scale of 0 to 14. The low numbers being things that are very acidic and the high numbers being things that are very alkaline. And around kind of 7 is a kind of a neutral score. So you might already measure pH at home. If you have a swimming pool or if you have an aquarium, you might be testing the pH. And the reason you do this is because the things that live in that aquarium or the people that swim in that pool don't want it to be too acidic and don't want it to be too alkaline. We don't really want to be drinking or touching battery acid or drain cleaner. And the same can be said of organisms that live in water and fit the fish and the turtles and things. They don't want things to be too acidic or alkaline either. And the same can be said with our soils. So we measure soil pH to find out if the soil is too acidic or too alkaline, because if it's too much of either way, it can actually affect soil health. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that at the end. So what you need to get your pH test started, you would have received our kits in the mail. We've sent you some universal pH indicator dye. So that's this kind of bluey greeny liquid in that vial. We've also sent you some barium sulfate powder. Now these are the 2 items which will test your pH. These chemicals are safe to use, but please don't swallow them, don't sniff them, don't touch your eyes when you're handling them. And once you've done your pH test, the best thing you can do is go and wash your hands afterwards. The other things we've provided in the kit are our pH chart. We've also given you a white plastic board or some laminated plastic paper. And you've also got a plastic pipette and a paddle pop stick and a little stirrer. The other thing you need to do your pH test is some soil. So I've gone and dug up some soil from my backyard. You need to go and get a soil sample from where you have buried your undies. The best thing to do is dig down a little bit, collect a handful or 2, you don't need very much of the soil, in the top 10 centimetres is great, and bring that back to do your pH test. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a small handful of that soil. I usually do it as about the size or diameter of a 20-cent piece. That's fine. Then we take our universal indicator dye and our pipette, and we squeeze the pipette, put it in the dye and let go, and that will put some of the dye into the pipette. And then you're going to put maybe 5 or 6 drops of that dye carefully on the soil to wet that soil. And then you're going to take the barium sulfate powder, place a little bit on the end of your paddle pop stick, and just sprinkle it over that soil in the areas that you've wetted. Now you have a look, and what's going to happen is you're going to see a colour change. And when you get that colour change, that soil is telling you what your pH is. But how do we work that out? Well, this is where we take our chart, our colour chart. So once you have a colour change in your soil, you just line that colour up against the chart and you kind of try and work out which colour best fits that soil. So my soil is quite interesting because it's got some flecks of green and other flecks of kind of purple. So that kind of means it's a little bit in the middle. It's kind of a bit like that dirty brown colour. So I think my pH is probably going to be something like 7.5. So once you've done that, you might have a completely different pH. You could have a very acidic soil, which might be one of the lighter colours like the greens or the yellows or the light greens, or you might have a very alkaline soil where the colours are more purple. So you've done your pH test, but what does it all mean and why have we done this? Well, pH can actually affect our soil health, and it can do this in a number of ways. Firstly, pH can affect how plants grow by altering the availability of nutrients in the soil. So if you take a look at this chart, you can see how, depending on whether the soil is quite acidic or in a more neutral space or more alkaline, that can change the availability of nutrients in the soil. So for example, a very acidic soil has very low availability of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium and sulfur. Whereas in an alkaline soil, the availability of those trace elements, the iron and the boron and the copper and the zinc, they're less available. So that's why we want our soils to be more of a neutral range from sort of 6 to 7, or even just slightly acidic is good too. So knowing our pH helps us predict and also manage our soils and our plant growth. And we can do this in 2 ways. One is that we can manipulate our pH. So if we have a very acidic soil, we can add some lime, which actually increases the alkalinity of our soil. Or you can also add some dolomite, depending on what else is in the soil. Other way, if you have a soil that's very alkaline, you can do things like adding compost or manure or mulch, especially things like pine needles and pine mulch are very acidic. So those kind of things can help lower the pH and create a more acidic soil. Another way that we can manage our pH is by selecting the kinds of plants that grow in soils, because some plants are more tolerant of acid or more tolerant of alkaline soils. So for example, plants like blueberries and apples and potatoes, they all like a soil that's more acidic. Whereas plants like lavender and some of the cabbage family like cauliflower and Brussels sprouts and broccoli and also cucumbers, those are the kind of plants that prefer more alkaline soils. So you can go and do some research and find out what different kinds of plants, like different kinds of pH. You can also do some more tests around the school. We've given you enough of the indicator dye and the barium sulfate that you could go out and collect a range of soil samples across different places in your school, and you could see if the pH is different on those sites, and then you could think a little bit about how you might then manage that to improve your soil and plant health. The other way that pH can affect our soil health is by affecting microbial activity. So just like we don't really want to be drinking drain cleaner or battery acid, microbes that live in the soil, the billions and billions of microbes in just even a teaspoon of soil, they don't really want conditions that are really acidic or really alkaline either. And this is something that we want to learn more about as part of the Soil Your Undies challenge, which is why we've asked you to collect your soil pH data. So we want to know the pH of your soils, and then we're going to compare that with how decomposed your undies are at the end. And hopefully that might tell us a little bit about as to whether the pH in your soil has contributed to the level of microbial activity in your soil. So thanks so much for watching. I hope you've learned something about pH today, and I hope you enjoy doing your pH tests. Stay tuned. We'll be back again so you can learn more about your soil health. See you later.